Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome and thank you all for coming tonight. I'm Judy Greenspan, the Director of Public Programs here at the Center for Jewish History. And on behalf of the Center and our partner organizations, the Leo Baeck Institute and the American Jewish Historical Society, we're very pleased to welcome you to tonight's screening and panel discussion of the film From Swastika to Jim Crow. The film, produced and directed by filmmakers Stephen Fishler and Joel Suture, was originally released 19 years ago. But in response to recent events, the increase in anti-Semitic, anti-immigrant, and racist incidents and rhetoric, there has been renewed interest in this film and a strong feeling that now is the time for its timeless message to be heard again. Based on the 1993 book by Gabrielle Edgcomb, the documentary tells a little-known story of Jewish scholars who fled to the US from Nazi Germany. Confronted with antisemitism and xenophobia here as well, a surprising number found an unlikely refuge, teaching at historically black colleges in the Jim Crow South. Reviewing the film in 2001, Sam Friedman of the New York Times described the documentary as, quote, bearing witness to a chapter of Jewish and African American history that has remained almost unknown. In the New York Daily News, Eric Mink wrote that the film is, quote, an affirmation of the human spirit, of the ability of one human being to touch another, irrespective of race, religion, or politics. I'm not going to say any more than that now because Stephen and Joel are here tonight, and after the screening we'll be joined by Dr. Charles Chavez from George Mason University for a conversation moderated by Dr. Brian Jones, the Associate Director of Education at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. You can read a little about our four panelists in your program notes, but a few highlights by way of introduction. Stephen Fishler and Joel Suture have been friends since the age of 9, which I love. According to their very entertaining biographies on their website, they grew up in, quote, a rough and tumble Brooklyn neighborhood, and early on they took the rebellious road, declaring themselves anarchists while still enrolled in Brooklyn Technical High School. So, we're in for a good conversation. In 1970, two of their NYU student films caught the attention of their film school instructor, Martin Scorsese, who encouraged them to use film as a political tool. They founded Pacific Street Films in 1971 and have produced and directed a wide range of documentary films since then. And as you can see in your program notes, Joel and Stephen have received numerous awards over the course of their careers, and both the Museum of Modern Art and the Harvard Film Archives have honored Pacific Street Films with career retrospective programs. Dr. Charles Chavez Jr. is the Assistant Professor of Conflict Analysis and Resolution in History and Director of the Program for History, Justice, and Racial Reconciliation at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University, and this is why I have notes up here. So he too is the recipient of numerous grants, awards, and fellowships, and is the author of the upcoming book, Maryland, My Maryland, The Lynching of Matthew Williams and the Politics of Racism in the Free State. And he's editor of For the Sake of Peace, Africana Perspectives on Racism, Justice, and Peace in America. Finally, our moderator this evening, Dr. Brian Jones, is the Associate Director of Education at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. He recently completed a PhD in urban education at the City University of New York Graduate Center and is currently working on a book about the 1960s student uprising at Tuskegee Institute. So we are thrilled, and it's a privilege to have the four of them here tonight, and very meaningful to us to share this story here at the Center for Jewish History. Telling stories, preserving memories, looking to the past to help explain the present, all are central to the work we do here. So before we begin, I'd like to share a few words about the place where you're sitting tonight, and just a show of hands, who here has never been here before? Oh, this is wonderful. Good. So you haven't heard me say this before, which is good. All right. So to me, The center is a rare gem in this city. It is a world-renowned research institute for scholars of Jewish history, a destination for public programs, concerts, exhibitions, a place to do your genealogy, and the Center for Jewish History is home to our 5 partner organizations and their extraordinary archival collections. So the American Jewish Historical Society and the Leo Baeck Institute, our partners in tonight's programs, along with our other partner organizations, the American Sephardi Federation, Yeshiva University Museum, and the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, together possess the largest repository of Jewish archival material outside of Israel. And I think it's safe to say that most people walking by this building on West 16th Street, many of whom have told us they thought it was a post office, have no idea that tucked away inside is an astonishing treasure trove of materials that span 1,000 years of history and include millions of documents, hundreds of thousands of books, thousands of artworks, ritual objects, recordings, and film. So in other words, this building is quite literally filled to the brim with stories, and tonight we'll have one more. So here's a glimpse of what this building looks like, what our archives look like. This is part of just one floor of the American Jewish Historical Society's archives. And this is located in a 12-story building behind us, which is top to bottom filled with the objects that I've just described to you. So not surprisingly, even a quick search, which we did prior to this program, reveals some fascinating material relevant to tonight's film. John Hertz is one of the professors profiled in the film, and you'll hear more about him also in the panel discussion. And pieces of his life are documented and preserved in the archives of the Leo Baeck Institute. So for example, we have his passport, which is here, and here's his photograph. And I believe this was stamped in 1938 when he was studying in Switzerland before coming here. And we also have letters that he wrote to his family when he took part in the delegation, the US delegation to the Nuremberg trials after the war. LBI also has audio cassettes filled with interviews that Professor Hertz gave about his early life. Best of all, the collections and the stories they tell are not meant to be hidden away. Our online collections like these are accessible to the public, as are our reading room, library, and genealogy institute. Exhibitions, public programs, conferences draw from and showcase the treasures and stories in this building. So if you're not already on our mailing list and you'd like to be, you can see that we quite obviously left something for you to sign and turn in after the program. And outside, you should please pick up flyers of our upcoming programs, our May-June program calendar, and we hope you will come back again and often. So our panel discussion after the film will conclude with audience Q&A, and after that, we hope that you'll join us in the Great Hall right outside the auditorium for a reception. So many thanks, and now our film tonight, From Swastika to Jim Crow. Please welcome our panel to the stage.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. Welcome to the Center for Jewish... I say welcome. This is my first time, too, by the way. But thank you for coming out tonight. Let's give another round of applause for that film. My name is Brian Jones, and as I was said before, I'm the Associate Director of Education at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Next to me here is Joel Suture and Stephen Fishler, the executive producers of the film. And all the way on the other side of the stage is Charles Chavez Jr., Assistant Professor at George Mason University. So we're going to talk for a little bit and then open up for questions from the audience. So while we're chatting, think about what you are wondering or what you're thinking about. First, I think, why don't we start with just the origins of the film and then talk a little bit about the history that's covered in the film. I see, we see Gabrielle Edgcomb, whose book the film shares the title with her book on this topic, and you were saying that she did the research.
The origin of the story is really very simple. I was on vacation in Florida, and I had gotten a copy of the New York Times, and just serendipity, I see this letter to the editor, and I think it was in the wake of the Khalid Mohammed, some kind of anti-Semitic speech he gave. And the letter was just very simple. It said, I remember a time when I taught at a black college. I was there it is. They were very supportive. And if you want to delve into the story, it's a wonderful book, and the book is written by Gabrielle Edgcomb. When I got back to New York, I called Steve. I said, this is really something that's interesting. Let's look into it. And we basically found out that John Hers lived no more than a mile from where we were in Westchester. He lived in Scarsdale at the time, and then contacted him.
We tried to contact him, but he was an older guy at the time, and when I called him up, he hung up the phone. So I wrote him a letter. He never answered the letter. We ended up sending sending package FedEx with a letter in it, which then he actually did read. But he was really the first scholar we met, and we did go down to Washington, D.C., and we did meet with Gabrielle, and we really joined forces with her. She was really a fantastic asset and a great person to work with.
Yeah, and actually preparing for tonight, I was looking at her book, and she tells a story. I mean, this film is set in the South, but she tells a story about when she came here from Germany, her family landed in New York City. And that actually she shared the sense of dissonance because she was a little girl in school and little white girls told her, don't play with the little black girls. And so she shared the sense of dissonance of coming and experiencing racism.
I think she said, she was told, don't ride with the tribe. Yeah. And that really struck her. That and an earlier experience she had when she was a child in Germany and went to a zoo that had some Africans as an exhibit in the zoo. And this really, she pretty much was very involved in civil rights her entire life. And this book was just one aspect of that.
Yeah.
The sad thing about it, Gabrielle did all the primary source research for this. She was well known within the civil rights circles in Washington. She was outspoken. She had gone down to demonstrations, and she basically was dogged in her research regarding these civil rights scholars. Now, the thing is, she was always very skeptical about whether this film would ever get made. And I would call her every day, and she'd go, did you raise the money? And I'd say, Gabrielle, don't raise the money. Don't worry. You're not going to raise the money. You're not. And I go, yeah. Unfortunately, the documentary world, no matter how many films you do, is an impossible world. Even back 20 years ago. Finally, we got the grant to put us over the top. She was overjoyed. Unfortunately, she never lived to see the premiere, and that was the sad thing about the situation.
Oh, that is sad. Well, it's really great that she got to appear in the film, and I'm glad you're speaking about her to keep her name and research alive. Let's bring you into the conversation, Charles. You have research about this time period and about the history. Part of your research is about the history of relationships between black and Jewish communities.
Yeah, so my research focuses on historic relationship between blacks and Jews during the early civil rights movement, and specifically the way that that relationship informed the classical phase of the civil rights movement, the Black and Jewish Alliance that we most know about that took place during the classical phase, the 55 and onward part of the civil rights movement. And so that's part of the work that I do as a historian, but I also look at the ways in which these historical relationships and issues can inform modern day situations that we find ourselves in today.
So does this film ring, how does this film ring compared to your research? Is this, what else is there to the story besides what we're seeing in the film?
Yeah, so I think from what I've seen in the film, this is my third time seeing it. I think what I definitely see is that there's more complexity than what we see. And as you mentioned, documentaries, obviously, you can't cover everything. But I think for the most part, there's a positive relationship that's described, a positive experience, that's described from the professors. But in my research, I've discovered that the situation wasn't always so positive, specifically outside of the South. Most of you may not know, but most HBCUs and most of those featured in the film are in the Deep South. But you also have HBCUs that are in Pennsylvania as well, the northernmost HBCUs. And the research that I've found at those universities where you had Jewish refugee scholars was that they were not so welcomed by students and or faculty. And so that was something that I discovered in my research.
Right, you were saying at Lincoln in particular.
Yeah, Lincoln University specifically, you had a professor by the name of Joseph Furt who came in 1938, who was an economist, and he described where students were being sympathetic towards Hitler, at different types of meetings and events. Where he was present, and that was really discouraging it to him. But on the other side, he had a lot of support from African American students and some faculty, but it wasn't all as positive as I think the documentary does a good job of showing, or this whole idea of the solidarity that we see throughout the film.
And so what about the black press, or what about the discussions that are going on in black media about, like, how aware were people of what was going on in Germany?
Yeah, so I provide some slides from my research, if you don't mind. So this is a slide here from the Afro-American newspaper. This is a press that I'm really familiar with. It's based out of Baltimore, one of the oldest family-owned African-American press that's still in existence today. They were able to cover the black and Jewish relationship and the situation that was going on in ways that the white press could not and did not, right? So the idea of the similarities between blacks and Jews being evident and being visible with the rise of Nazi Germany, as well as with Jim Crowism in America, the black press was really familiar with that, and they were able to shed light onto what this meant globally and for African Americans and Jews alike. But I think their response to the lynching is really based on the historic relationship between blacks and Jews in America, and that's based on the relationship and the situation that the social movement that began with the NAACP at the turn of the century. So blacks and Jews came together to form this organization, as you know, based on the similarities that both Jews and blacks suffered, Jews with the pogroms, and then African Americans with the rise of lynching that took place at the nadir of race relations at the turn of the 20th century.
One of the things that struck me seeing this film this time was the sense of physical danger for violating the rules that these refugee scholars faced potentially, or their guests at their home faced physical danger. And then they had come from a place in the U.S. South, and they'd come from a place in Germany where they also faced physical danger. This wasn't just like mean looks or abusive comments. This is real mortal danger to black people and to Jewish people in the U.S. South and in Germany. Is this something you were thinking about as you were making this film or as you were interviewing people?
I think it was clear that there was a lot of danger. But on the other hand, and maybe that was more the HBCUs in the Deep South, the campuses were sort of these sort of islands within a sea of racism that provided an environment where people could interact with each other. And I think that's one of the reasons, at least the scholars that we put in the film here, their careers and their teaching at these colleges became their lives. I mean, that was the entire focus. Certainly, that was the case with Berinsky, the last scholar who was featured in the film.
HBCUs don't get credit for this. Like in popular memory, they're thought of as these, kind of segregated, maybe isolated institutions, not as these like cosmopolitan, interracial spaces of freedom and liberation in the Deep South. But that's certainly a picture that comes through in the film and in the book. Okay, that wasn't a question, in fairness. Another thing I was thinking about watching this is the issue of socialism, which has come up again in American society, is suddenly no longer a bad word. But there and here, Germany and the U.S. South, it seems like anti-communism, or the label, was a stick with which to beat people or to attack them. You say more about that part of this story.
Yeah, I think in my research specifically on lynching and what I've seen in Maryland specifically that I thought was unique is there was a debate that arose between the International Labor Defense and the NAACP. And it specifically had to do with who was going to represent the Negro, right? And I thought that, in talking about communism and socialism, as you mentioned, I thought about this debate that was taking place. And I saw how it was, again, coming up further along in the 20th century, as we mentioned, like in the video. I thought it was really unique because on one case, the International Labor Defense felt like the NAACP wasn't going far enough, right? And I remember one quote from an ILD representative, an attorney. He said that the NAACP is only good for getting Negroes a plea bargain, right? And in the lynching cases I investigate, it is, in fact, the ILD, the International Labor Defense, that are supporting individuals and their families of who are either near lynched or lynched in a way that the NAACP was not. And so I think that's something that's unique and interesting as well.
What did you notice about this issue as it came up in the interviews you were doing for the film?
It did come up. I mean, obviously with Poppenheim, Joyce Ladner probably, had the best stories about just what went on at the time. And we're still in contact with Joyce. She's retired, but she's still very vocal. And it was an issue. I mean, it was obviously an issue because it was, during the Red Scare, and to stick your head up out of the trench, so to speak, and vocalize, good chance it was going to get shut off. But yeah, it's part and parcel of that period. And even when we were, this film is 20 years old, and we driving around the South the way we did, you could still feel it. I mean, there was still a palpable tension.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of work to be done to recover the role of people who weren't just labeled, falsely or otherwise as socialists or communists, but people who actually were, like Poppenheim, or people in the ILD, or the black socialists, for that matter, who are part of this era. But in all cases, that was part of the ways that these movements were attacked, and the ways that both Jewish activists and black activists, it seems, were attacked. What do you make of the end of the film? You gesture towards Stokely Carmichael and the rise of black power, but it strikes me as an interesting dynamic that in the earlier phase, it seems like the professors play a kind of leavening role, a role of giving confidence and courage and opening space for what becomes a student movement in the South. And then in a later phase, the student movement seems to be moving beyond the professors. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean,
all of you.
The reality was that there was a Black Power movement, and this kind of discord happened, and we didn't want to. I mean, well, clearly the film does paint this, pretty picture, and we really were. I think we were genuinely moved by the kind of relationships that these scholars had with their students. That's really a beautiful thing, and when you see the film, you know how real it is. But certainly there was the rise of the Black Power movement, and it did affect things. But I don't think it really cut the cord in any significant way in terms of the role that these professors played. Because Berinsky continued to teach at Tougaloo. They built a house for him on campus, and he's buried on the campus. So that kind of relationship, yeah, maybe there were some difficulties and some philosophical and political discord, but I think that over and above that, his contribution and his role was really respected.
Can I just add one thing about that? The end of the film was somewhat of a problem for us because even back then we were kind of cognizant we didn't want to have this kind of driving Miss Daisy kind of formula. These Jewish professors did great things for African Americans. So we really tried to find a balance whereby you get the impression, and I hope it comes across, that both the professors and their students basically the energy went back and forth, and that there was some kind of real equation that made sense, as opposed to, yeah, okay, they come in and they did great things. I hope that comes across.
Yeah, there was a quid pro quo. These schools opened up, gave careers and lives to scholars, often, certainly before and the beginning of the Second World War. They were here on temporary visas. They were afraid they might get sent back. So, we tried, as best we could to show both sides of that relationship.
Yeah, like I said, in my research, I've seen some more of the complexities that you were able to kind of highlight. And I think, for me, I think it's a great fit, just like with most research, to find beginning, middle, and end, right? And we oftentimes go to the Black Power movement as that time where the alliance broke down. But however, I believe that early on, this was always something that internally was going on at HBCUs, right? How much are we depending on these Jewish professors, right? The whole idea of paternalism, et cetera, is something that I've seen throughout the 20th century and throughout my research. But what's unique about it is that, yes, that you had to have that moment, right, where there's a transition that's being clearly marked. But I think along the way this was going on. I know at Morgan State, for example, we had a Jewish professor by the name of August Meyer, whose papers are at the Schomburg, and he actually debated Malcolm X at Morgan State University, which I'm a graduate of Morgan State. I did my PhD there, HBCU in Baltimore. And so for me, having those type of discussions and seeing those type of discussions take place early on, and that division and complexity is important to understand.
Yeah, and certainly in my research of the student movement at Tuskegee, it's not clear cut, actually. The student movement moves beyond what most of the professors want, including black professors, want out of the students or expect from them. And many of them were very old-fashioned and did not expect the students to suddenly make demands of the curriculum or expect to be changing the way teaching and learning was going down. And sometimes not, you can't make too many generalizations, but there were certainly cases that I found of Jewish professors, not refugees, but Jewish American professors who were more staunchly with the black movement as it got more radical than even conservative black professors. So that's possible as well. I see hands in the audience already, so we are getting close to the time when we're going to have questions. People are chomping at the bit. Let me ask one last question then, and we'll get right to the audience. My last question is, this is almost 20 years old. What is your experience of showing this film for all that? Have you been showing it continuously the whole time, or are you bringing it back now?
Well, I think that right after it was broadcast, we basically had money from public TV to set up screenings around the country. This is around 2000, 2001, and the feedback was great. We showed it at, HBCUs, we showed it at regular colleges, and, there was a great deal of interest. 2009, the Museum of Jewish Heritage wanted to put together an exhibit called Beyond Swastika, Jim Crow, which would use the artifacts and a bit of the film as a means to kind of revisit the experience. And that actually traveled around from 2009 to, I think, 2012 to a variety of both African American and Jewish institutions. Last year, Steve took part in the U.S. Holocaust Museum's sponsored event in Washington. That was last July, and there have been a few other events since. And it's essentially, we think, it's an evergreen film that's worth.
Is there a different reaction from an audience at a mostly Jewish place to when you've gone to a mostly black place like an HBCU?
I think the fact that there's clearly an evidence of increased anti-Semitism and racism in the country today is, I think people look at the film or come to see the film not just to see some kind of interesting piece of history that happened 50 years ago, and it's interesting to know about it. I didn't know about any of this, but now people are concerned, and there's an interest in seeing films that might, provide some example of a time when things where people struggled in a different way to come together.
Are you saying that these kinds of prejudices exist today?
I think I read that in the New York Times this morning.
Let's see what the audience thinks. Why don't we take some questions?
By the way, thank you for that wonderful film. So in today's global political climate, how do we forge ahead? How do we keep two peoples who, you know, traditionally have been allies from killing each other? In other words, what I'm saying is, how do we prevent both blacks and Jews from taking it out on each other?
Let's organize a couple more screenings like this, and we can look at the film and talk about it. But I mean, that's somewhat facetious, but I mean, by getting people together to talk about it, and I think one thing that's important is looking at some of this history. We tend to only see in the newspaper what happened yesterday, but there's also some important lessons in seeing what happened 50 years ago and longer.
Hi, I'm wondering if this is available on any of the streaming services like Canopy, which is a free service through the public library systems in this country?
Currently, it's not. But I mean, if you contact us, we can. We're caught in this matrix of a million different, competing streaming services, and we're trying to deal with Netflix and Hulu, try to basically get the film out there. But as right now, it's not available, on any of those services.
I have a question for both Joel and Stephen. I was curious in researching the reviews on this film online today that I couldn't find anything. There's nothing on IMDb. It was mentioned that there were reviews in the Times, I think, in the Daily News. Have you done anything to try to get that onto the internet?
That's a good question. We always argue about that. I think the problem is we need a good publicist, and that's really the name of the game these days. But if you do, I mean, some of the
There were reviews in lots of places that, I mean, just Google the film, New York Times or Daily News, the Post. There were a lot of reviews. Thankfully, they were good reviews, but there were a bunch.
The best review, I think, the most in-depth review was Sam Friedman's New York Times review, and I think that dates back to 1990. And I think if you just Google Sam Friedman from Swastika to Jim Crow, it basically will come up.
Thank you. Hi. The movie mentioned that there were 1,200 German Jewish professors who came to the United States, and only 50 of them taught in black colleges. My question is were the other white American professors? And the other caveat, when you tried to reach John Hertz, who was the only one that touched this issue of nation and nationalism in his book Nation State. Maybe in 94, 95 he had some, did you discover anything, disagreement that he didn't want to be dragged into this issue?
So to the number of Jewish refugee scholars, I'm not sure if it was only 50. Based on my research, there was a lot more than that. And some of those that are featured in the book are, the book is not exhaustive. I've seen more, and those at Morgan State as well as Lincoln and those other schools that are oftentimes overlooked, those are not featured in the original research.
I think one of the things is that these scholars didn't self-identify as a group. Now we're sitting here looking at them, refugee scholars at HBCUs, that's an interesting phenomenon in history. But at the time, these were a lot of individuals. There wasn't any Facebook, to have a Facebook group, refugee scholars. So, but in fact, when the film was first released, and we did go screen it in a number of HBCUs, very often, like North Carolina Central, someone, after the screening, a professor would come up and say, I worked with a German Jewish guy, I studied with him years ago, and it would be someone that we had never heard of. So we have, we're not the historians, academics in this particular area. We're going on that figure of 50 to 75 and gleaned somewhat from the work that Gabrielle did, but it's very likely there could be more than that.
Yeah, the interesting thing about this is there's still a lot more research to be done. I go back and forth with Sam Friedman, who now does a lot of writing for Haaretz. he was interested in one particular guy that I never heard of. So there is more research to be done, and I think that Gabrielle tried to do the best she could without much funding. So yeah, there's just probably a lot more information to be gleaned from this.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't the reason this is being shown tonight is because of the parallel of what is happening in today with the current administration? I mean, is this part of that or not?
Well, I think you can always draw parallels. I mean, every anti-Semitism, racism, it's part and parcel of American history. So, yeah, you can draw whatever inferences you can, but I think that what we're trying to do with this film is kind of basically say we have these problems now. We've had these problems in the past. More than likely, we'll have these problems in the future. So maybe in an incremental fashion, we can slowly kind of maybe come to a resolution. Just to make a long story short, the two of us grew up in Brooklyn in the 1950s. And I got to tell you, Brooklyn then was like a series of provincial villages. And I lived in a working class area. I would get into fights with kids all the time. They were Irish kids. They were Italian kids. Everybody hated everybody in Brooklyn in the 1950s. It's not the artisanal millennial paradise. It's not Jerusalem anymore. So that problem was back then. And before that, in the 1930s, you had the same stuff.
Well, for me, I think it's important as a historian, but also as a scholar of conflict resolution, to understand the moment that we're in. I'm glad you brought that question up, because when I think about the research that I've done on Black and Jewish relations and the alliance that historically has, thrived for the most part up until the Black Power movement, I'm kind of sad in a lot of ways, because I see what's happened, recently with Tree of Life, and before Tree of Life, we had Charlottesville, and before Charlottesville, there was the Charleston Massacre, right? And so constantly as we move through history, we see the similarities within the struggles of Jews, not only in America, but also globally. And it's really unfortunate that we're not able to kind of, come together and realize that and understand the importance of the alliance, not only historically, but today. And I agree with you, not the plug, but we need to do more of these, because I think it opens the dialogue up, and it also exposes the public to the narrative, right? That the narrative, needs to be fully told, and your work does that. And after we're able to get the narrative straight, then we can move towards racial healing and reconciliation. But it's not until that truth comes before reconciliation.
Well, on that note, I think we have to call it a night, but thank you all for coming out. And let's give our panelists another round of applause.